Hey guys, tonight we are sneaking into the darkened halls of medieval castles, past torchlight corridors and velvet curtains, to uncover a strange truth that might just make you rethink your own bedtime. You've probably heard modern gurus bragging about sleeping only 4 hours a night, CEOs and tech moguls boasting like insomnia is some kind of Olympic sport. But here's the twist. Long before the age of email and energy drinks, medieval kings were already pulling sleepless shifts, and they didn't even have glowing smartphones to blame. You probably won't survive this schedule, but don't worry. We'll wander through their restless nights together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step quietly into a royal chamber, though it feels less like a place of rest and more like a war camp disguised in velvet. The bed is massive, yes, carved from oak and draped with embroidered fabrics. But the room itself is alive with interruptions. Servants shuffle in and out, carrying parchments, trays, and whispered news. Torches sputter. Guards outside clank their armor. Sleep here is never deep. It's more of a half-conscious drift, easily broken at the slightest sound. You think about how much people today prize their 8 hours, tucked under cozy blankets, with blackout curtains. Medieval kings would laugh, or maybe weep, at the idea. A mainstream historical fact flickers into your mind. In the Middle Ages, rulers often averaged just 4 to 6 hours of fragmented sleep, far less than modern health experts recommend. And yet they carried the weight of entire kingdoms on their shoulders. But the odd detail makes it worse. Royal bedrooms weren't private sanctuaries. Imagine trying to sleep while courtiers or advisors literally lounged in the same chamber, or guards hovered nearby, muttering under their breath. Some kings even had scribes posted through the night to jot down sudden commands or dictations. Your pillow talk wasn't with a lover, it was with a nervous secretary holding ink-stained fingers. And here's where the scholarly debate drifts in. Historians still argue whether kings voluntarily embraced this sleeplessness as a mark of vigilance, or if it was simply forced upon them by the crushing machinery of medieval politics. Was it pride, paranoia, or just the reality of running a realm without weekends off? You picture a king lying awake, not in peaceful stillness, but in anxious waiting, ears tuned to footsteps, heart quickened by every creak in the floorboards. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. It had to be. Decisions of war, alliances, and survival were literally knocking on the chamber door at all hours. Your footsteps echo softly as you wander farther through the castle, noticing how even the night air seems restless. Somewhere beyond the walls, peasants might be snoring after long labor, but here, in the royal heart of power, rest is always a luxury too fragile to last. The torchlight flickers, shadows stretch long across the tapestries, and you realize this first truth. Medieval thrones were not built for dreamers. They were built for men who traded their sleep for vigilance. You drift deeper into the castle's stone labyrinth, passing through narrow passageways that echo with drafts and faint murmurs. The walls themselves seem to breathe, cold, damp, and unyielding. You can feel the weight of centuries pressing down, as if these stones have memorized the restless nights of every ruler who once tossed beneath their ceilings. Picture yourself pausing in front of a heavy oak door, banded with iron. Behind it lies a bedchamber, but don't expect comfort. When you slip inside, the first thing you notice is the bed. Not a simple frame, but an enormous structure raised high off the ground, almost like a stage. Curtains of indigo and saffron fabric hang around it, embroidered with lions and crosses. It looks grand, yes, but as you step closer, you realize it's less a nest for dreaming and more a throne of restless duty. Kings in this age often slept sitting slightly upright, back against pillows, ready to be roused at any moment. Why? Because nighttime was never secure. Assassins didn't wait for daylight, and rebellions didn't politely announce themselves after breakfast. In fact, a mainstream historical fact here. Some rulers, like King Henry IV of France, centuries later, kept weapons by their bedside, a tradition likely inherited from older medieval practices. Sleep was always laced with paranoia. Now you lean closer and notice something strange. In the flickering candlelight, a servant is curled up on a pallet at the foot of the king's bed. Another sits on a stool, fighting to keep his eyes open. Privacy? Forget it. Oddly enough, medieval kings rarely slept alone. Their beds might have been shared with advisors, family members, or even favored knights. Not in the modern sense of intimacy, but as a way to display trust, or, let's be honest, to prevent midnight daggers from slipping through the curtains. Imagine the sounds. Someone snoring, someone whispering, someone coughing. The air is heavy with the smell of tallow candles, damp wool, and maybe last night's mead. No wonder sleep came in fragments, never the blissful oblivion you're used to. And here comes the scholarly debate. Some researchers insist this arrangement of shared chambers reflected a cultural belief that total privacy was suspicious, even dangerous. Others argue it was just practical. Rooms were cold, heating was limited, and extra bodies meant warmth. Either way, you can feel the king's exhaustion. Even surrounded by people, he is alone in his responsibility. You imagine yourself lying in that towering bed, eyes open, hearing distant bells toll from a chapel tower. Somewhere in the dark, a courier might be galloping toward the castle with urgent news, and your sleep will be shattered as soon as the message arrives. You barely have time to drift off before reality claws you back, and you realize the irony. Peasants in their cottages might have been sleeping deeper and longer than their rulers, undisturbed except by the occasional barnyard noise. Power didn't buy peace of mind, it stole it. As you step back out of the chamber, the corridor feels colder. Your torch sputters, and you sense the castle itself watching. The night isn't still here. It's a living thing, pressing against every wall, poking at every shadow. And you carry this thought with you. Kings weren't just robbed of their sleep by duty, but by the very architecture of fear woven into the stones around them. You walk farther along the drafty corridors, and the faint glow of torchlight gives way to darkness. The castle breathes differently here, quiet but tense, as if you've slipped into the hours where the world itself is paused. You imagine the king stirring awake in his chamber, not because he has rested enough, but because the rhythms of medieval life refuse to allow deep slumber. Here's the truth. People in the Middle Ages didn't sleep the way you do now. Forget the neat 8-hour block that modern experts preach. Medieval kings, and in fact much of society, practiced what scholars call segmented sleep. You drift into the idea, 2 stretches of sleep, broken apart by a wakeful interlude. The first sleep lasted a few hours after dusk. Then came the watch, when people might read, pray, write letters, or even visit neighbors, followed by a second sleep before dawn. Now, imagine being a king in this routine. You lie down in your high-curtained bed, servants huddled around, and after the first chunk of sleep, you wake. The castle isn't silent. The courtyard might echo with the sounds of guards pacing, dogs barking, or the creak of carts making late-night deliveries of grain. Instead of feeling irritated, this was expected. Your body knows it won't sleep straight through. Here's your historical fact. Manuscripts from the period mention this first and second sleep explicitly. Ordinary people prayed or whispered dreams aloud during the watch. But here comes the odd detail. The king might use this interval for counsel. Imagine advisors called into the chamber by lamplight, their faces pale, arguing strategy over parchment maps while you, half awake, sip watered wine. Midnight isn't leisure here. It's work disguised as ritual. You pause, imagining how exhausting it must be, and yet also how normalized. And here comes the scholarly debate. Some argue that segmented sleep was entirely biological. Humans naturally wake after a few hours in darkness. Others insist it was socially constructed, encouraged by candle rituals, religious customs, and limited artificial light. For kings, it hardly mattered which theory was true. The wakeful interlude was the perfect moment for scheming nobles to whisper, for priests to urge penance, for messengers to arrive with news from far-off borders. Picture this. The king sits on his bed's edge, wool cloak wrapped around him, while shadows crawl across the stone walls. He's not alone. Maybe a scribe crouches at a table, scribbling down orders. Maybe the queen mutters a prayer. Maybe the sound of rain patters against narrow windows, filling the silence between words. It's a slice of time when night itself feels fragile. When you're awake, but the world is half asleep. And just when you think the king might lie back down for his second sleep, another interruption comes. The chapel bells strike the hour. A servant whispers of unrest in the town. A torch outside sputters out, plunging half the courtyard into blackness. You can feel how his body yearns for rest but can't settle, because the responsibilities don't keep to neat schedules. You wander away from the chamber, through cloisters where monks sometimes shared the same pattern of segmented sleep. The night air outside tastes damp, and the stars scatter across the sky like spilled grains of salt. The peasants in the village below are probably stirring too, some of them lighting hearths, some sitting up in bed, but none carry the same weight the king does. You tuck this thought into your mind as you drift forward. Medieval kings weren't just suffering from restless luxury. Their entire world was structured around a rhythm of wakefulness that stole away the chance for long, unbroken dreams. The very night was divided, and with it, so were they. You descend a narrow spiral staircase, the stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air grows cooler, heavy with the smell of smoke and faint incense. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, a chapel waits, flickering with candlelight. This is where you find another reason kings slept less. Religion wasn't a daytime activity. It bled into every hour, including the darkest ones. You slip into the chapel and see the king already there, shoulders draped in a saffron cloak, eyes shadowed from lack of rest. His hands are clasped, knuckles white, as he mumbles prayers in Latin you don't understand. The glow of Voda's candles throws sharp shadows, gilding the edges of his face in trembling light. It's not a moment of peace, it's duty. Night prayers, vigils, or even sudden penance sessions punctuated a ruler's schedule, as if God himself demanded a share of their sleep. Here's your historical fact. Many rulers observed canonical hours, structured prayers that broke the day and night into intervals. The matins, for example, often took place in the middle of the night, pulling monks from their cots and sometimes dragging kings with them. Imagine being shaken awake at 2 a.m, not to fight, but to sit through hours of chant echoing against stone walls. Now for the odd detail. Picture the king's physician hovering nearby with a cup of spiced wine or even a strange herbal concoction. Some rulers believed poppy juice or valerian root could help balance wakefulness and fatigue. Of course, sometimes it worked the opposite way, keeping them too alert, trapped in restless pacing until dawn. Medieval medicine wasn't always on your side. The scholarly debate comes here. Did kings themselves follow these rigid hours, or did they simply delegate them to chaplains? Scholars still argue whether night vigils were a personal discipline or mostly symbolic gestures, enforced when the ruler needed to prove devotion. Either way, the effect was the same. Nights fractured, carved into slices by bells and obligations. As you watch, the king kneels, back stiff, while monks chant in slow, droning rhythm. The sound reverberates through your bones like a low hum, strangely soothing, but impossibly long. You imagine how heavy his eyelids must feel, the way his body aches to collapse into bed. Yet duty keeps him upright. If God watches through the darkness, what ruler dares to be caught sleeping? You wander from the chapel, ears still full of chant, and notice how dawn creeps pale across narrow windows. The king will not get those lost hours back. Instead, the morning's counsels and petitions will arrive soon. You realize something unsettling. Rest wasn't just interrupted, it was ritualistically denied. The king's body didn't belong to him. It belonged to crown, church, and kingdom, and all three demanded slices of his night. So you keep walking, knowing the candles never truly burn out in this castle, and neither does the pressure pressing down on its ruler's eyes. Sleep is a luxury he cannot afford. And the night is never really his. You step back into the royal wing, where the air feels thicker, buzzing with the low murmur of voices. The night hasn't gone silent, it's only shifted tone. You catch the shuffle of boots on flagstones, the clank of iron at a guard post, and the soft thud of doors opening and closing. Even here, in supposed rest, the castle hums like a machine that refuses to shut down. The king's chamber isn't empty. Advisors move in and out, scribes clutch parchments, and couriers arrive at impossible hours. Picture the king sitting on the edge of his high bed, wrapped in a russet robe, hair unkempt, face creased from half-sleep. He leans over maps sprawled on a table, candles dripping wax like frozen rivers across the surface. His eyes are tired, but the urgency in the room makes rest impossible. Here's your historical fact. Medieval kings often held council at odd hours, sometimes deep into the night. Chroniclers note how rulers like Edward I of England worked through midnight sessions when crises struck. A kingdom didn't run on convenient schedules. War, famine, and rebellion had their own timing, and the king had no out-of-office hours. Now for something odd. You imagine a jester hovering at the edge of this gathering, bells jingling softly, ready to break the tension with a quip or absurd antic. Yes, a fool in the middle of midnight strategy. It sounds strange. But some kings kept their jesters close, even during serious matters. A quick laugh could puncture the heaviness, keeping minds sharp. Though, truth be told, the laughter often hid just how bone-tired everyone felt. And here comes the scholarly debate. Some argue that these late councils were exaggerated in chronicles, meant to paint rulers as tireless servants of their realms. Others counter that the unpredictable nature of medieval politics, border skirmishes, messenger delays, conspiracies, meant midnight meetings were not the exception, but the norm. Either way, the effect is clear. Sleep was a casualty of power. Picture yourself there, leaning in as the king listens to conflicting voices. One advisor demands more taxes, another warns of revolt, a third insists on prayer before action. The arguments rise and fall, filling the chamber like waves. You glance at the king. His eyelids droop, his jaw slackens, but he cannot surrender. To close his eyes, even for a moment, risks missing a decision that might topple his throne. The waxy air feels oppressive. The flicker of torches makes shadows dance across the walls. and you almost imagine the shadows mocking the council itself. Elongated versions of tired men pretending to be strong. Outside, the night deepens, but inside, the king's body grows lighter, as though sleep might steal him if he lets go. And yet, he doesn't. He signs papers, issues commands, and murmurs to his scribe. His night once again becomes someone else's day. You walk away from the chamber, footsteps echoing in the long corridor. Behind you, the low voices still buzz, proof that kingship was as much about surviving exhaustion as it was about leading armies. And as you drift deeper into the castle, you can't help but think, if insomnia were a crown, this king already wore it. You slip into the quieter corners of the castle, but even here, the silence is deceptive. A soft creak of floorboards above you, the distant rattle of chains on a portcullis, and somewhere, faint footsteps pacing the walls. All of it keeps the night restless. The king, though, has another enemy of sleep beyond religion and politics, the gnawing presence of danger. Imagine lying down in a vast curtained bed while knowing enemies might be lurking within your own walls. The medieval world wasn't stable. Courtiers plotted, rivals schemed, and ambitious nobles sharpened their daggers in the dark. Even trusted servants could be bought. Sleep meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. Here's your historical fact. King John of England, infamous for his troubles with rebellious barons, reportedly changed sleeping quarters frequently to avoid assassination. Some monarchs rotated chambers, sometimes even disguising where they lay their heads, as if they were fugitives in their own fortresses. That wasn't eccentricity, it was survival. Now the odd detail. Picture a servant lying across the threshold of the king's bedchamber, not for comfort, but as a human alarm system. If anyone tried to sneak in, the servant's body would stir, alerting the king. Sometimes dogs slept inside chambers for the same purpose. Imagine relying on a snoring hound to guard your last line of defense while you try to rest. The scholarly debate slips in here. Did this constant vigilance mean kings genuinely slept less, or did they simply experience restless, light slumber, waking at the smallest creak? Some historians suggest that rulers became conditioned to sleep in half states, one eye metaphorically open, much like soldiers on campaign. Others argue that chroniclers exaggerated their wakefulness to dramatize the burden of kingship. Either way, the result is the same. The bed never truly felt safe. You picture the king rolling over in the dim light, sword within reach, eyes flicking toward the doorway every time a candle sputters. He doesn't relax. He merely lies still, waiting for morning. You realize that for him, night was never a time of trust. It was a battleground of shadows and suspicion. As you wander out onto a parapet, the cool night air brushes your face. Guards pace with spears in hand, their breath fogging against the sky. Far below, the village sleeps peacefully, hearth fires glowing faintly through shutters. The peasants fear hunger, storms, or sickness, but they aren't lying awake, wondering whether their cousin is plotting their downfall. Power draws enemies, like moths to flame, and it robs kings of the very thing peasants enjoy freely: deep, unbroken sleep. You stand there, staring at the starlit horizon, and you understand. Rest wasn't stolen just by bells, prayers, or politics. It was stolen by the simple fact that a crown paints a target on your head, and that target glows brightest when you dare to close your eyes. You follow the draft of cool air down another corridor, and it leads you into the king's private hall. The fire here burns low, casting long orange tongues across carved beams. A new kind of fatigue seeps into your bones, not the exhaustion of danger, but of sheer indulgence. For kings, night wasn't only about fear or duty. It was also about endless feasting, entertainment, and rituals that stretched until dawn. Picture a banquet table, groaning under platters of roasted meats. Bowls of stewed fruits, trenchers piled high with bread, goblets of wine clink against one another, spilling ruby droplets across linen. The king sits at the head, dressed in teal velvet, his face lit not just by candlelight, but by the sheer thrill of excess. Around him, courtiers laugh, argue, and sing. Sleep? It doesn't even enter the conversation when there's another round of mead to drink. Here's your historical fact. Medieval feasts often lasted late into the night, with courses stretching for hours and entertainment, musicians, jugglers, storytellers woven between them. Records show that coronation feasts or victory celebrations sometimes carried on until sunrise, leaving rulers dazed and sluggish for days afterward. Now for the odd detail. Imagine a servant carrying a spiced digestive drink of warm wine mixed with pepper or even ground pearls. Yes, pearls to help the king's stomach handle the flood of food. These concoctions were believed to protect against indigestion, though in reality they probably made the problem worse. So instead of restful slumber, the king might spend the night clutching his belly, wide awake. And here comes the scholarly debate. Were these marathon feasts truly common, or do chroniclers exaggerate them to glorify royal generosity? Some argue these were rare spectacles, while others insist the sheer frequency of court banquets explains why medieval rulers often battled obesity, gout, and sleepless nights. Either way, the effect is undeniable. Extravagance ate away at rest just as much as politics did. You imagine the scene winding down, the hall sticky with spilled wine, the air pungent with sweat and smoke. Minstrels pack away their instruments, dogs lick bones beneath the tables, and courtiers stumble half-drunk toward their pallets. The king, though, is left in a strange haze. His heart races from too much rich food. His mind buzzes from the chatter of 100 voices, and his eyes refuse to close. The night grows late, but sleep lingers just out of reach, taunting him. As you walk out of the hall, you notice discarded platters glinting in the dying firelight. The castle smells of overindulgence, meat, wine, wax, sweat, and you realize how much weight those scents must have carried into the king's chamber, clinging to him, keeping his body restless. Power didn't just bring paranoia, it brought endless parties, and both stole the hours he might have spent dreaming. You step into the cool dark again, lungs relieved to breathe clean air. And the contrast strikes you. Peasants in their cottages likely ate bread, cheese, and broth before sleeping soundly. The king, meanwhile, was trapped in feasts that left him overstuffed and underslept. In a world where rest was already scarce, even celebration became another thief of sleep. You leave behind the stale air of the banquet hall, the smell of roasted meats still clinging to your clothes, and drift toward a quieter space, the king's study. Here, the candles burn lower, their flames steady, as if even the wax itself is weary. And yet, instead of rest, you find another reason for sleeplessness: paperwork, petitions, and the grinding gears of bureaucracy. The table is cluttered with scrolls tied in red ribbon, sealed letters stacked like bricks, and maps with ink smudges where fingers pressed too long. The king sits hunched in a saffron tunic, quill in hand, his shadow stretching across the parchment like an accusation. He isn't a warrior tonight. He isn't a host. He's a clerk, drowning in ink when he should be dreaming. Here's your historical fact. Monarchs were expected to personally review and approve documents. Even if secretaries and scribes drafted them, the king's signet ring was the final stamp of authority. Some rulers, like Richard II of England, were notorious for long nights spent inspecting charters and correspondence. Sleep didn't stand a chance against the tide of wax seals and ink. Now for the odd detail. Imagine the king pausing mid-letter to sprinkle sand over fresh ink, preventing smudges. Sometimes that sand wasn't sand at all. but ground eggshell or even crushed bone. A strange detail, isn't it? Even in the quiet of paperwork, you can feel the macabre weight of medieval resourcefulness. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did kings genuinely labor over these documents, or did chroniclers inflate their involvement to flatter them? Some historians claim scribes did the heavy lifting, with rulers only adding final touches. Others insist kings were far more hands-on, especially in matters of justice and diplomacy. Either way, the hours bled away, and the candle stubs shortened while sleep slipped further and further out of reach. Picture yourself leaning over his shoulder. His handwriting grows messier with each line, his quill scratching like a restless insect. A servant yawns in the corner, head nodding. Another pokes the fire to keep it alive. And still, the king works, eyes ringed with shadows, thoughts sharp, but body exhausted. The weight of every signature is another pound of pressure on his chest. Another minute stolen from the night. When at last he sets the quill down, dawn is already stretching its fingers through the high windows. Birds stir in the courtyard. Servants shuffle to life. The king hasn't rested. He's only transitioned from one kind of labor to another. The cruel joke of it hits you. While the kingdom sleeps, the king works. When the kingdom wakes, the king must still be awake. There is no pause button, no retreat, only endless motion. You step away from the study, weaving behind the scent of ink and parchment. Your footsteps echo against stone, and the castle feels alive again with the noise of morning. You realize that medieval kings weren't just robbed of sleep by fear, feast, or faith. They were robbed by ink and duty too. Even the quietest room in the castle was a thief. You wander upward, climbing a final staircase that leads to the royal tower chamber. The air feels different here, thin, hushed, as if you're standing at the very edge of the world. Dawn spills faint streaks of silver across the sky, painting the stones with the promise of a new day. And yet, the king hasn't closed his eyes. He sits by a narrow window slit, wrapped in a heavy teal cloak, staring out over his lands. Below, the village stirs. Smoke threads from chimneys. Roosters crow. Carts rattle on dirt roads. The people are rested, ready to start their day. The king, by contrast, is already frayed. His night carved into scraps by prayer, politics, feasts, fear, and ink. You can see it etched into his face. The hollow eyes, the tight jaw. Here's your historical fact. Chroniclers often described rulers rising before dawn to lead hunts or preside over morning councils. Kings like Louis IX of France and Edward III of England were famed for their relentless schedules. The idea of sleeping in would have been scandalous, indulgent, even sinful. Rest wasn't just lost by accident. It was sacrificed deliberately to prove discipline and devotion. Now for the odd detail. Some rulers turned to peculiar remedies to push through exhaustion. Imagine a servant bringing the king a draught of wine laced with crushed emeralds. Yes, emeralds, believed to invigorate the spirit. Others relied on herbal brews of sage, thyme, or even ground up rooster testicles, thought to restore virility and focus. The medieval pharmacy was both creative and absurd, a desperate attempt to trick the body into obedience. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did kings genuinely sleep less than modern CEOs, or is this comparison unfair? Scholars still argue whether chroniclers exaggerated their insomnia as propaganda, portraying rulers as tireless servants of crown and church. But even if the hours were embellished, the pattern of broken, fragmented rest is undeniable. The architecture of their lives, bells, councils, danger, indulgence, made continuous sleep nearly impossible. You picture the king straightening his cloak as the sun rises higher. Courtiers knock at the door. Servants bustle with trays of bread and broth. Guards shift outside, waiting for orders. And you feel the cruel rhythm of it. Another day begins. demanding his presence, his judgment, his energy. The night has stolen his rest, and now the day will steal the scraps that remain. You step back from the window, leaving him silhouetted against the pale sky. In that moment, you realize the bitter truth. Medieval kings weren't envied for their sleep. They were envied despite the lack of it. The crown glittered, but it weighed down heavy on the eyelids, dragging them open when all they wanted was to close. So here you are, drifting back from those stone chambers, the echoes of sleepless kings still ringing faintly in your ears. You've wandered through their world of candlelit councils, rattling bells, midnight feasts, and uneasy prayers. You felt the drag of their heavy crowns, the kind that stole rest as ruthlessly as any enemy. But now let's loosen the grip of history and step gently into the present. You don't need to pace a torchlit hall or worry about raiders creeping at the gate. You don't need to rise before dawn to prove your worth. Instead, you can simply let your shoulders fall, let your breathing slow, and let your mind soften. Imagine the castle fading behind you. The tapestries dissolve into quiet darkness. The clatter of goblets silences into a steady hush. You're no longer trailing a sleepless monarch. You're simply floating in calm space, where the only duty left is to rest. Your eyelids grow heavier with every breath, and the soft hum around you feels almost like the faint lull of wind against old stone walls. Unlike those kings, you aren't expected to carry a kingdom on your back tonight. You're only asked to let go. So breathe deeply. Allow the weight of the day to slip away like a cloak sliding from your shoulders. The night is yours,